I'm very flattered that Nikki thought to invite me here tonight, and it happens to be a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've always complained that law students come out of law school and they're ill-prepared for the realities of practicing law. And I think Nikki's program probably is giving you skills that you really need in order to do that successfully. So tonight I'm going to focus on some softer topics, and I just think it's important for you to recognize that we all have different perspectives. So you may or may not agree with what I have to say, but hopefully you'll understand and respect the perspective. So, as you know, building a successful practice is a difficult endeavor. The challenges we have all faced or will face in the transition from student to practitioner, during which we have to overcome the gap between both institutional and practical knowledge and the very nature of the profession itself, which is really conflict-driven, and in a profession that is increasingly competitive, this is a very difficult thing. Tonight we're going to talk about three things that I personally believe are really foundational to having a successful practice or developing one. And they are relationships, excellence, and risk-taking. We're going to also talk about diversity tonight. And I know you're looking at me and you're wondering what could she possibly have to say about that. But everyone has a story to tell. And it is important to remember that the storyteller and each person who hears the story has a perspective. And the perspectives are often different, and it is the difference that enhances us and that adds value to our lives. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, about my story, so that you can understand my perspective as I share some advice with you tonight. So first, I hate to state the obvious, but I'm a blonde woman. And it's not as easy as you might think to enter into a large law firm practice. And for me, I'm a business attorney, a corporate securities attorney. I did debt and equity, public and private offerings when I began my career. That was my area. So practice area, large law firm, practice area dominated really by men. And I look like a cheerleader. So that isn't an advantage, in case any of you wondered, okay? In fact, I have experienced sexual harassment and gender bias from the very beginning of my career and continuously throughout. I also need to disclose that I'm over 40. And I recognize that society likes to say that the 40s are the new 30s. But I don't feel that way. I feel much older than my 44 years most days when I'm practicing. Practicing well and sincerely and having a robust professional life, it's exhausting. And so I won't pretend to you that it's easy. I am routinely feeling many years beyond my actual age. And I'll just tell you a little anecdote. A friend of mine who's an employment lawyer broke the news on my 40th birthday that the federal government considers me officially to be old, right? Because a lot of the age discrimination laws come into play when you turn 40. And so I thought, great, not only am I old, but I'm so old, the government feels like I need additional legal protection to live my life, and that was kind of a bummer. I also want to point out that although I am a practicing attorney, I am the general counsel of a company that requires a lot of diverse legal services. We can't, in our in-house legal department, possibly cover all of the areas that are at issue. And so we hire a lot of outside attorneys and firms to work with us. And we do that all over the country at all levels of practice, young associates, very experienced partners in many different practice areas. And so I think I have a unique perspective to share with you tonight because most lawyers are only ever lawyers, and they don't experience being a client except in the case of marriage or divorce, death, things like that. But I've actually been a consumer of legal services. I am a consumer of legal services every day. And so I see the other side of practice. I know as a client what expectations are for a business that needs legal services and is going to have to pay today's market rates to get them. They're very high, and the expectations, therefore, are very high if you're a client. So I think that's an important perspective for you to understand that I have. And also, because I happen to be an executive officer of Capital Impact, I'm also a business person. And so fundamentally that sort of changes the dynamic, and I'm sure Nikki can speak to that. You know, being a lawyer is often very impractical. We learn about cases in law school. We have grand visions of what it means to be in the law and to advocate for our clients. And we often don't have a lot of practical business experience. And I think people who enter law school with practical business experience really have a great advantage, because that perspective really informs how you practice law if you also happen to be a lawyer. Okay, so with that being said, these are the characteristics I think that you need to know about me to understand kind of where I'm coming from when we talk about relationships, excellence, and risk-taking. First, relationships. If there's one thing that I want you to think about when you leave here tonight, it is that relationships are the key to a successful practice. You will learn of new opportunities through your relationships. You will advance your career through your relationships, and you will achieve better results for your clients as a result of your relationships. Relationships are everything. They're the backbone of practicing law. And I like to talk about relationships rather than connections, because the word connections, if you look at the definition, it really suggests a linkage or an association with another person, where the word relationship suggests a deeper bond. And I think in this world, we're increasingly focused on social media and virtual communications, and we tend to value the number of connections we have on LinkedIn, the number of contacts we have in our database, the number of friends we have on Facebook. We forget about how important it is to have real relationships with people. And I think that's a mistake. Because of the hundreds or thousands of people you connect with through social media, only a very small group, probably a handful, will actually be instrumental to you in your career as you develop it. And that handful will be comprised mostly of people with whom you have relationships. I mean, connections sometimes are useful, but the people who have relationships with you are the people who are motivated to help you in a time when your practice is challenged. They are the people who challenge you to be the best lawyer that you can be. Connections with whom you have no other real meaningful relationship can't do that for you. So I'd like to point out that how you incorporate people who have different life experiences than your own into your personal life will impact how successful you are in developing your professional life. I believe that diversity in your personal relationships will allow you to become more comfortable with and open to diversity in your professional lives. My most valued personal relationships are with people with whom I would appear to have nothing in common on a superficial level. I count among my closest friends Muslims, Jews, Catholics, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, Greeks, Croatians, Egyptians, Iranians, Afghanistan. I have friends from all walks of life and countries all over the world, and many of them are not lawyers. We recently got together for a play date. I have a 6-year-old son, and many of my friends also have kids in the same kind of age range, usually I'd say from anywhere from 4 to 10. And my husband and I have this thing. I found that with all the chaos that even 2 kids can create, it's easier just to have 20, right? I mean, the house is destroyed either way, so you might as well have 20. And it's a fabulous way to kind of reconnect with the adults in your life that you don't really have time to see if you do kind of a cocktail play date. So, and I gotta say that having a drink in hand makes the whole thing so much easier. So we recently had about 20 of our friends, and they're people that I just described to you, over with their kids. And it was really fascinating because I actually hadn't thought of it until I was thinking about what I would say to all of you tonight. And I looked back on what those relationships really look like, and I thought about that evening, and I thought, how interesting At any moment during that night, you would have seen and heard adults of all faiths and walks of life openly debating politics, openly discussing the differences in their religions, and speaking multiple languages. My son, who is 6, actually had at one point a discussion with Hadi, his Muslim friend from Iran, about what happens when you die. And how fascinating is that, right? I mean, a 6-year-old really doesn't have any understanding of that. They're sort of figuring it out for themselves. And somehow ended up in a conversation with a Muslim. He's Catholic. He ended up in a conversation with a Muslim about what that would look like. What are the differences? And I just thought that was so fabulous, right? I mean, you really just don't see that very often. And I think if you look at me superficially, you wouldn't necessarily expect that that's my life story. But this is my life story, in fact. I love being with people who are not like myself and who have different points of view. And I think one of the things that you have to understand is that there is a commonality, right? We don't superficially look like one another, and we don't even think like one another, except in certain core ways. We have the same values about how we want to raise our children. We have the same respect for education. We have the same desire to establish bonds with our neighbors. We have respect for different viewpoints and a real appreciation for sharing them. Those are the common themes in my friendships and those relationships. And I think that diversity in my personal life enables me to much more easily understand and accept and even encourage diversity in my professional life. And I feel that in my work, I like to emphasize inclusion rather than diversity. Diversity is sort of the term everybody likes to use, but we really want inclusion, right? We want people to feel comfortable enough with one another that they can share views, they can have arguments, right, respectfully. They can share constructive criticism. I like to have teams that are cohesive in the workplace. And I think often I see firms and corporations creating diversity environments where the numbers look good, but in fact people really aren't communicating and working with one another in a way that is inclusive. It doesn't matter, you can have diversity all over your firm, but if people don't feel comfortable working with one another as a cohesive unit, as a team, it's meaningless at the end of the day. And so I like to bring the kinds of things that I do in my personal life into my professional life, because I think that enhances everyone's experience and sort of general happiness in practicing law. And I think it really enables us to more effectively understand our clients' viewpoints. Because fundamentally, really, if we bring it back to what's important on a professional level, it's your ability to have a diverse client base. That's necessary for business reasons, frankly. You can't today in this world survive on a couple of big clients that look and act like you. You need to be able to have a broader scope and diversity in your client base in order to be successful. And I don't think you can really achieve that effectively. You can't market yourself as someone who will understand someone's viewpoint if you have no experience ever in conversing or socializing or having intellectual discussions with people who are not like yourself. So I encourage everyone to really look at their personal relationships first before the professional, because I believe the one follows the other. Secondly, I'd like to talk about excellence. I hear all the time from friends who are at firms, partners of big firms, who are training young associates, moving associates through the ranks. I see it myself as a client, as a consumer of services, that there is, for reasons that I can't explain, a tendency when you graduate from law school these days to not want to work hard any longer. It's as though you have that golden ticket, and so that's it. That's all you need to do, and life is going to be good for you. But the reality is there are 1.3 million lawyers in this country as of the end of last year. And that number grows by the thousands, the tens of thousands, every year when more law school graduates move into the workforce. And so it's really, really important that you remember when you graduate from law school that you must be excellent in everything you do. You will be competent eventually. I think people think when they graduate from law school, I know I did, that you are already competent. You're a lawyer, right? You've passed the bar, you've graduated, you feel like, you know, that's it, you're the lawyer. But you're not. You've just begun your education, actually. And so you have so many things to learn. So I would say maybe 5-7 years out, you begin to have competency. And then maybe 10 years out, you begin to have developed an expertise in your field. And it used to be that that transition from competency to expertise was enough, so that when you were 10 or 15 years out, you were building a robust practice, you were a partner, and you were respected in the legal community and among your clients as being an expert in the field. That's really no longer the case, because there are so many experts. I mean, eventually, right, you're just at every level as you progress, you are progressing right alongside thousands of other people who are also becoming experts on the same path that you are. And so you have to somehow separate yourselves from your peers at a certain point if you want to be successful in a law practice. And I think for me, as a client, a consumer of legal services frequently, I have to say that that's excellence. I work with many partners, and even partners who are truly recognized experts in their field routinely send me documents that need to be edited. And I can't tell you how furious I am knowing that I've spent $780. I just paid a bill last week. The partner was billing out at $9.95 an hour. And I routinely edit his work. Now, does that make sense to you? No. And so when I talk about excellence, I mean, it's not Nobel Prize winning excellence that I'm talking about. It's I mean, we're thought leaders, right? I mean, I think a lot of these people, they become experts because they're thought leaders. They understand concepts maybe in a way that the rest of us do not, and that's fantastic for them. But at the end of the day, as a client, you get work product. And I don't want to edit it, frankly, for $9.95 an hour, right? So I feel like excellence is a theme that we need to really focus on when we graduate from law school, and a program like Nikki's is really a great starting point for that. I think it's that transition from the impractical to the practical that you really need as you graduate, and so I'm very supportive of that. And I'll tell you, the other key to achieving excellence, in my opinion, is setting standards for yourself and also accepting constructive criticism as you go, right? It's very hard to learn how to accept criticism. And I'm going to tell you, at one point, sort of in the middle of my career, I had a performance review. And I had always, up until that day, had excellent performance reviews. And on that day, I was told that my work was indeed excellent, but everyone hated working with me. And the reason they hated working with me was because I made all of them look bad because I worked too hard. And I was shocked because my supervisor at the time said, you know, maybe you should dial it back so other people don't look bad. Okay, now to this day, I have to tell you, I feel that this is absurd, okay? Anyone in business will tell you that you want everyone to rise, right? And you don't want to bring people down to the lowest common denominator. That's not how you build a successful business. And so the fact that I was being told to dial it back, rather than hearing that other people had been told to dial it up, was really an eye-opening experience for me. And so I will tell you, like Nikki, I had an epiphany that day. And for me, it was that this really isn't a great fit, right? I have very high standards for myself and my peers, and I just decided that I wasn't willing to work at a place that wanted me to lower them, and that would be institutionalized, in fact. I just thought that was just not acceptable for me, and I couldn't commit to that for a long term. So I really decided immediately that I would be leaving and I would find a new position. But, as I said, it's important to understand how to accept criticism, and there is always a kernel of truth, no matter how absurd someone is, right? They have a perspective, and it may not be yours, but there's something valuable in it if you think about it hard enough. And so I went home that night and I thought, well, what can I learn from this? And I realized that well, I don't have a performance issue, but I'm not a good member of a team. And in order to be successful and build relationships in my career, I need to be a good functioning member of a team. People need to want to work with me. You can't have good professional relationships if everyone says, she's poison, she'll make you look bad because she works harder than everybody else. It's crazy. You just can't have that, right? People need to like you. They need to want to work with you. And so I went to work the next day and I said to myself, I'm now going to make everyone I work with look good. And I spent every day until I did leave the company eventually, but I spent every day on that team making a point of praising the work of my peers, vocally acknowledging the contributions of my peers to the project that we were working on together, and doing that with our supervisors, so that they would receive the credit that they were due for the work that they were in fact doing. It may not have been to my standard, but it was valuable in its own right, and I learned to recognize that. And I'll tell you, although I didn't stay there, I to this day have strong relationships with the people who are on that team, and in fact one of them was at the playdate I mentioned earlier. So this is about, everything that you do in your career is about relationships, but excellence has to be the underlying theme, and it has to be what you always remember will ground you no matter what is happening in your life. And I believe it's the thing that will enable you to prevail in any adverse circumstance. So these are the two things that really work together. I would also say that as a woman, having experienced sexual harassment and gender bias, these are the kinds of experiences that can make you very angry or bitter, and I know plenty of people who have allowed that to happen to them. And I've never done that. And the reason is because these are emotions that are very draining and they're very counterproductive. And I wish that society were different. And I wish that I had the additional energy to be a community activist and change society. But I don't. I have just enough energy in me to get through the day and to raise my 6-year-old and be a good wife to my husband. And so I choose, and others may not make this choice, but I choose to just work harder to prove myself in the workplace when these things come up. And I found that channeling that energy, not in a counterproductive, angry way, but in a productive way that enables me to showcase the talent and intellect that I have, has every time been the antidote to one of those experiences. So I can't tell you what would work for you, and especially for the women in the audience and folks of other groups. I can't even begin to imagine some of the adverse circumstances that you'll experience in your personal life and your careers. I don't pretend to even begin to be able to understand all of that. But I can just tell you in my own very limited experience as a woman that you can make these experiences positive, productive experiences for yourself as you grow in your career. And I encourage you to think about how to do that so that you can move beyond them and be successful. Okay, the third topic I want to talk to you about tonight is risk-taking. And I believe that attorneys are, by nature, not risk-takers. Nikki's an exception, right? I mean, leaving the practice of law to do what she's doing now is, thank you, it's a daunting sort of undertaking. And so I really respect that. But the idea that a lawyer would go out and do that is actually fairly rare. And so in my experience, just general observation is that people are in college and they don't know what to do with their lives. They're not math, science people, and they'd like to have a stable life. They're afraid to start a business. They don't have the business experience to go and get an MBA. They're not sure they have the interest. And so law school is kind of an easy place to go. But it's really, I think, more about, it's not about not thinking about your career, but it really has a lot more to do with an adverse reaction to risk, a lack of desire to take on risk. You go to law school, and it's sort of funny because all of the things that you are afraid of, consciously or unconsciously, you learn about. You learn about all the negative consequences to these things you're afraid of in every class that you take in law school. And so that, I think, sort of underscores whatever your adversity with risk is, right? Whatever your challenge there is, it's every day you learn something about how to manage risk and how to avoid risk. And so I think you become more risk adverse as you're in law school. And then you go to a firm, and of course everyone wants you to give the advice that's really down the line. It's in the middle. And they want you to do that, and you're really trained to do that because you're afraid of being wrong, right? You're afraid of being known to have given bad advice, or to have stretched, right? To help a client stretch into something that might have been a more risk-based decision. And it's hard to do that because the cards are stacked against you once you're in a firm. The firm wants you, and all of your peers want you to be very conservative in how you give advice. That's how you preserve the reputation of the firm and mitigate any kind of potential liability around the advice that you give. But I think it's really important to understand risk and to be a risk taker as you develop your practice. And I think that's especially true today because the market is so competitive. And so I think understanding where your client's risks are and understanding your client's risk tolerance is of critical importance as you develop client relationships. And you really, in the beginning of your practice, you won't have a lot of direct client contact necessarily. It depends on where you go. So this will sort of come over time. And as it comes, and you really need to really learn to how to associate with your client and what their main concerns are so that you can provide more risk-based advice to your client. The decisions that your clients make are not necessarily the clients that you would be comfortable with as a lawyer. Your job is not to make the client decision, it's to enable your client to make an informed decision for themselves. And that's not to say that you, and when I talk about risk, I'm not talking about taking a risk that an illegality would not be discovered. I'm talking about risk within a legal sort of risk scale. And so to give you an example of that, I had a client once come to me wanting to do a transaction. I looked at it and I said, well, the structure of the transaction is in effect a tax avoidance scheme, and it's illegal. We can't do that. And the client really insisted that they wanted to structure the transaction that way. And I had to say at that point, I can't help you. I can't continue to represent you if you insist on doing a transaction that is clearly illegal. I won't support that. On the other hand, I had another client fairly recently say to me that they wanted to sell a business line. And in negotiating that transaction, the buyer of the business wanted unlimited indemnification for loss. And that is unlimited as to amount, scope, duration, everything. And I advised the client against it, and I explained the issue. And the client said, I understand your position, but I must sell the business line. It is more important to me to sell this business line right now because of the drain on the balance sheet that it represents than it is for me to take the risk on the indemnification. I'm comfortable with that trade-off. And so we closed the deal. And we did it on the terms that I wouldn't have recommended or ever accepted myself. But my client's risk tolerance in that situation is not my own. And so I have to respect that. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And that's a client that will always come back to you as a lawyer, as a practitioner, because they know they can trust you to provide the information they need to make that decision. So when they're making it, they understand the risk, but they nevertheless are the person really making the decision. I think the corollary to risk-taking with your clients is risk-taking in your professional lives. There have been a couple of points in my career when I've taken a risk and I've sort of jumped off the path that everyone recognizes as being sort of the traditionally accepted path to success. In fact, my parents and my friends were mortified when I told them that I was going to leave DLA Piper, where I had a very vibrant corporate securities practice, to go in-house. I mean, they just couldn't understand that. And they might have understood had I had a practice that wasn't successful at the time, but I was doing pretty well. And so jumping off that particular path was very difficult for people to understand. But the one thing that I found that I have in common with a lot of attorneys who are very happy in their professional lives is that they took risks and really extended themselves, challenged themselves to take risks in their professional lives. And they may not have chosen always the path that was well understood by other people in the profession or in their families. And these are people who are generally happy. And it's just a general observation. It certainly worked out for me. Risk-taking each time I've done that has really enriched me. I mean, it's been challenging. My current position was another risk that I took when I left Fannie Mae to go to Capital Impact. And I'm very happy that I did, because for as challenging as it's been, I have learned something new every day. And literally, and you know, people think you're going to learn the profession and then it's all the same. It's not. I learned something new every day, and I love that about my life. Now, it's very stressful, right? I mean, not knowing what's going to walk into my office on any given day. You know, one day it could be an employment issue, another day it might be a tax issue, another day it might be the sale of a business, another day it might be a commercial real estate transaction. And on some days I might have 3 or 4 of those different issues come up all at once. But that sort of diversity within my practice is what creates the challenge for me and keeps it interesting. And that's not a choice that everyone would make for themselves, but it was the right choice for me. And I think it's just about, as you progress in your career, really thinking about what are the right challenges for you and what risks are you willing to take. And I submit to you that taking risks in this particular legal environment is really critical to your success. It's just about evaluating the risk. It doesn't mean take any risk, but I do think you need to think about risk-taking in your practice in a way that really lawyers never did before. So anyway, so I want to thank you for your time tonight, and I want to let you know that I would encourage you throughout your career, periodically, just reevaluate where you are. Think about, who are your relationships? Are you excellent in what you do? Can you improve yourself in some way, either personally or professionally? And have you taken the risks that have led you to a place in life that makes you happy? And I think that you should periodically think about those 3 things as your practice develops. And the answers will change over time. But you don't want to stagnate in your career. You really want to reevaluate periodically, and that's what will keep it fresh, and that's what will make you successful.
Can you ask a question?